this video series, we're seeing what catches our attention in the local newspaper from exactly 100 years ago and taking a closer look. This week, that closer look is at Prohibition. This is the headline 100 years ago today that caught our eye. We have so many questions. Why was it illegal when they seized the booze? And drinking it themselves? We'll come back to these later, but first let's talk a bit about why liquor was being seized in Montana in 1920. The 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution instituted prohibition, along with the Volstead Act, which outlined provisions for its enforcement. It was ratified in 1919 and went into effect nationwide on January 17, 1920. The meat of the 18th Amendment is in this statement, but there was a rather large loophole in the text of the amendment. While making, selling, or moving booze around was prohibited, drinking it was not. Those who had laid in a store of beer, wine, or liquor prior to the Volstead Act were perfectly within their rights to consume it. Montana activists, particularly the Women's Christian Temperance Union, had long been pushing for an end to alcohol use in the state. They managed to garner enough support for the 18th Amendment, and Montana was the 7th state to ratify it, and for the accompanying legislation within Montana to enforce it. Measure R-16 went into effect on December 31, 1918, over a year before the Volstead Act went into effect. Voters had passed the measure with 58% of the vote. Cities and towns all over the state held lively funeral bashes for John Barleycorn on the night of December 30th, 1918, and New Year's Eve was alcohol-free. The dozens of bars in Billings were faced with a new future. Prohibited from selling liquor, some proprietors went out of business and found new lines of work. The Billings Brewing Company converted its equipment to distill less potable potions like rubbing alcohol. Other bars turned themselves into lunch counters with soft drinks. And still others said that's what they were doing too, but carried on selling alcohol clandestinely. One Montana Avenue bar, the Blue Ribbon, was closed down after its owner was caught serving alcohol twice in 2 days. Under Prohibition, the illegal manufacture and sale of liquor, known as bootlegging, occurred on a large scale across the United States, and Montana was no different. Montana's wide empty spaces and abundance of wheat also made manufacturing alcohol an attractive prospect to some, and many a home kitchen brewed or distilled alcoholic beverages, which made their way into the hands of neighbors and nearby bars. Proximity to the Canadian border meant that a great deal of liquor was smuggled across the line. Canadian towns near the border soon set up liquor sales that were just for Americans, including specific export taxes. Rum runners might turn a great profit for their risk, but it could be quite dangerous. In the southwestern Montana raids described in the article on the left, lawmen seized the modern equivalent of over $850,000 worth of illicit liquor. And now back to our headline. Robert Westover had some moxie. When his car was seized along with its load of whiskey bottles just south of Laurel, some 6 months previous to the article, the local justice of the peace had ordered the liquor destroyed a few days later. Westover filed suit, saying that only a district judge could issue that order, and not a justice of the peace. The justice had said the local city attorney had told him he could sign, and so he signed. The justice also had gone to a warehouse to observe the order being carried out. When one of the officers dropped some bottles, the liquid that splashed up didn't smell like whiskey. The justice opened another bottle and tasted the contents, which tasted like tea. A third contained actual whiskey. When the rest of the bottles were smashed, all the debris was dumped in the Yellowstone, disallowing any testing of the contents. It had been stored for several days in an unheated building in bitter January weather. It was surmised at the time that if the liquid in those bottles had always been tea, they would have frozen solid and broken well before the day the justice was there. Westover's attorney strongly implied that the whiskey had been seized and then been stolen by officials for their own personal use. Though the local officials were not charged with any crime, Westover did win his case, and the current equivalent of some $93,000 for the cost of the whiskey plus additional damages. When it came to repealing Prohibition, once again, Montana was ahead of the game. It was the first state in the nation to repeal its enforcement laws in 1926 and essentially left further alcohol laws to local jurisdictions. The nation's tolerance for flagrant violation gave out, and citizens were horrified by the rise of violent crime in the wake of Prohibition. The 21st Amendment to the Constitution, which repealed the 18th, was ratified in December 1933. Utah cast the deciding vote in favor of repeal. Montana was the last state to vote to ratify it in August 1934. Some states and counties remained dry well afterwards, but it was no longer the law of the land. Thank you for watching.